So, do you guys want to learn about CSTs?
No.
Well, I'm going to tell you about it anyway because you'll need it for high school. Stewardship of creation is a CST that proclaims our social nature and how we are called to use our interdependence to work together to sustain a healthy environment for all of God's creations. It is not just about caring for the earth itself, but also about being responsible for one another. To understand the CST, you have to go back to the very beginning, Genesis, where the original call to stewardship occurs. Genesis 1 and 2 account for God's creation of humankind, Adam and Eve, and entrusting the abundance of his creations to them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." God wants humanity to grow in order to look after the multitude of his creations. The verse, "Be fruitful and multiply," refers to the social approach of stewardship. God made both Adam and Eve because stewardship requires partnership. This reinforces the concept that stewardship is communal and depends on communities to work towards a common goal. The fate of God's creations depend on humanity's efforts. It requires many of us to fulfill God's will of fruitfulness, as we all inhabit the earth and share the same responsibilities. This ties into this year's theme, "We are many, we are one," because despite our differences, we all share a deeper unity, the calling to protect our common home. Humanity's actions within recent years have failed to consider the earth's well-being and tend to fall short on God's true intentions. When God calls us to subdue his creations and exercise dominion, he expects us to love and care for them in his stead. However, we misinterpret it as having the earth and its resources at our full disposal, causing us to believe that we can do whatever we want with it. We perceive the meaning of dominion as having absolute power over all other beings, which results in a false sense of superiority. However, it is because of our authority that we serve the earth, similar to how the government uses their power to serve the people. The verses, "And the Lord commanded the man, 'You may freely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall die," represents the boundaries set for us and how violating these boundaries come with consequences. The free will given to us comes with accountability, as it is we who have to deal with the outcomes in the future.
Think about global warming and extinction. These are the results of crossing this boundary. How do you know about stewardship?
So there are actually a lot of official documents, such as the Catechism or papal documents that we can read about. Paragraph 2415 of the Catechism states that the seventh commandment, "Thou shalt not steal," forbids us from unjustly coveting things that don't belong to us or wronging others with respect to their belongings. Our dominion over other living beings should not be taken for granted, meaning that we shouldn't treat the earth and its resources haphazardly because it doesn't belong to us. We are simply the caretakers of God's land, and like those from the past, we'll leave it to future generations to inhabit. Although we have been given authority over other beings, we should not abuse this privilege. We have the duty to protect the integrity of creation, which can only be accomplished through collaboration and respect. Paragraph 119 in the papal document Laudato Si, written by Pope Francis, highlights how humanity's selfishness is the root cause of ecological crises. This section discusses the concept of anthropocentrism, which is the belief that humans are the most important beings on Earth, and how this complex blinds us from seeing beyond our personal interests. This limits us from learning more about God's creations, preventing us from forming meaningful connections with our natural environment. Humanity's anthropocentrism has created a barrier between us and the natural environment because we believe that everything on Earth is made to serve us. Stewardship is a social responsibility that requires us to be open-minded and heal the relationship that we have with ourselves and others in order to strengthen our communal bond. When we open our minds and stand united, we can truly see the beauty of God's creations and view them as our equals, because how can we begin to respect the environment if we don't take the time to learn about it? Virtues are concepts that we live by to lead fulfilling lives. They enable us to enact the morals and ethics we learn into practice. In stewardship, the capital virtues of generosity and humility are fundamental. Generosity is the virtue of overcoming selfishness and greed. It is the desire to give and involves personal sacrifice. We can be generous with our time, money, and resources by using them to sustain our communities and environment by actively participating in causes we are passionate about, such as volunteering or donating to organizations that support our beliefs. Acts of generosity are a response to God's generosity, as we are fulfilling God's will of protecting and caring for His creations. It requires an effort to make change, and whether we choose to or not makes all the difference. Humility means overcoming pride and recognizing that everything we have on earth is a gift from God, including all life forms and resources. Being humble entails having self-awareness of our possessions and that the earth is a shared space for all of God's creations. When we realize that it is God's trust in us that enables our management of the earth, we understand the value of God's creations and protect them for future generations to enjoy. Both humility and stewardship share qualities of care, trust, and consciousness, in which humans are responsible for preserving the gift of life granted to us. Greed is the vice of succumbing to selfishness and putting our desires above everything else, even at the expense of others. Humanity's greed for money and power has gravely impacted the global environment. For instance, unsustainable practices derived from greed result in climate crises and the degradation of the environment. Greed blinds us, preventing us from being stewards as we fail to recognize that our actions affect not only others, but also the very world we inhabit. We neglect the organisms that depend on ecosystems and ignore the fact that the world is a sacred gift for the past, present, and future to appreciate. Greed causes us to take God's gifts for granted, leading to the suffering of future generations. Stewardship of creation calls for us to work together to sustain the world we live in. The oil mines in Alberta, though significantly impact Canada's economy, bear far greater consequences on the environment. Okay, let's go for a walk. This article on Canada's tar sands addresses the lack of stewardship through the ongoing issues the Alberta oil industry has on Indigenous peoples and their communities. Indigenous livelihoods and practices are rooted in care for creation, which is being stripped through the oil mining industry. Oil companies have completely taken over Fort McMurray, completely surrounding the Indigenous community of Fort McKay in northeast Alberta. These lands are replaced with mines described to be larger than New York City.
Imagine 2 Mississaugas worth of land being exploited for oil.
This land that Indigenous peoples and wildlife depend on for survival is exploited for money, which violates Section 2415 of the Catechism, as the integrity of creation and Indigenous peoples are disrespected. This breaks the trust and relationship between society and the environment. Jean Lamancourt, an Indigenous environmental coordinator, advocates for the land's preservation, but is ignored as the mines continue to expand closer to her cabin. The fact that the oil mines are projected to expand displays greed, as they already generate billions of dollars. And the environmental concerns raised by Indigenous peoples are silenced. The government continues to strip the land of its natural resources, defying the CST of partnership in preservation and sustaining a healthy environment for all generations to experience. Okay, let's go home.
Wow! It's done. I finished up our painting on stewardship.